then why in God's name do you want to shutter it? Why don't you want to protect kids with disabilities? Why don't you want to protect kids who have been every decade denied equal access simply because of how much their parents make, the zip code they live in, the color of their skin? Why are you shuttering a department that's supposed to lift up those children? You're embarking on the department's final mission? You intend to put yourself out of a job? That's a little jarring to me. If you were a pediatric oncologist, I'd welcome that. Let's get you out of a job through cures, through healing, through ending of pediatric cancer. Federal investments in education began to increase dramatically in the 50s and 60s and 70s, in tandem with the rise of the success of the civil rights movement. Americans finally began to recognize the vast inequalities in our education system. Thus, federal funding was used to improve education access for students from poor backgrounds or minority students, for women, for people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. Finally, Congress established the Department of Education in 1979, replacing the Office of Education. Secretary McMahon, it's alarming that you and the president want to turn that clock back. You take us back to a time before any federal oversight of education, before many of the programs that guarantee free and equal access to education for all Americans. You said as much in your testimony. After all the Department of Education's work to ensure equal access to education, you're embarking on the department's final mission? You intend to put yourself out of a job? That's a little jarring to me. If you were a pediatric oncologist, I'd welcome that. Let's get you out of a job through cures, through healing, through ending of pediatric cancer. But ending a department that is supposed to oversee the education of our very youngest, to guide their future? Have you taken the time to educate yourself about this history? I'd encourage you to go ask students who attended school back then. Black students, brown students, students with disabilities, students from poor families. What was access like for them before the Department of Education? Frankly, eliminating the Department of Education, to me, is rather Orwellian. The president and his administration don't want an educated populace. Why don't we just go back to the book 1984 if it hasn't been banned? It's clear to me, this administration wants an uneducated electorate so that Mr. Trump and his courtiers can control thought, therefore control votes, and control the population. I'll note a secondary measure here that is going on. The increase in funding for charter schools. We know that charter schools originally were supposed to be incubators of the best ideas, great practices to be brought back into the public school education system so that every kid had an access to such things. But this administration and you, who want to put yourself out of a job, following the playbook, page 319 of Project 2025, first sentence, shutter the Department of Education. You're all following the book, that book. Too bad that one wasn't banned. And yet, privatizing is really the other ambition, an uneducated electorate and profit and privatization of our education system. Do you promise us that that isn't your ambition?
That clearly is not my ambition. I think I've stated that very well today.
Then why in God's name do you want to shutter it? Why don't you want to protect kids with disabilities? Why don't you want to protect kids who have been every decade denied equal access simply because of how much their parents make, the zip code they live in, the color of their skin? Why are you shuttering a department that's supposed to lift up those children?
Because those programs don't have to flow through the Department of Education, and they
can flow through the state. I was a state legislator. That's called shift and shaft. I've spoken with the governor of Pennsylvania. They can't pick up the tab anymore for education of our students, not to mention it would be inequitable by state, by state, by state. Why are you in this job at all? If you don't have a dedication to the future of our children, why are you in this job?
I, too, am a mother and a grandmother, and I want the best for my family going forward.
Vouchers.
For my grandchildren, for my great-grandchildren, and I hope to leave a legacy that we have established best practices for education that all the states can use. That would be a great legacy to be able to leave, to be able to show states these are some of the things that they can do. I think states have to look at their budgets.
Madam Secretary, the legacy you will be leaving is that I shut down the Department of Education. How we educate our children determines not just their future, but our own.
But the
I think it's a
department-
sad legacy you will leave. I yield back.
The Department of Education is not educating anyone. Well, I can say this, and I will.
Just weeks after this hearing, the Trump administration continued moving forward with its plan to reduce the Department of Education's role, while multiple legal and political challenges unfolded across the country. Although Congress had not passed legislation to eliminate the department, the administration continued pursuing reforms through executive actions and agency restructuring, making the future of the department one of the most closely watched education issues of 2025. That context is important because Representative Madeleine Dean's questions were not simply about one budget proposal. They reflected a much larger disagreement over the federal government's role in education. Dean argued that the Department of Education was created to help ensure equal educational opportunity, particularly for students from low-income families, students with disabilities, and communities that historically faced discrimination. Her concern was that reducing or eliminating the department could weaken those federal protections. Secretary Linda McMahon defended a different vision. Rather than arguing that education programs should disappear, she maintained that many responsibilities could be managed more effectively by individual states. Throughout the hearing, she emphasized that her goal was to leave behind what she described as best practices that states could adopt while reducing the federal government's role. That exchange highlighted one of the oldest debates in American education policy: how much authority should belong to Washington versus state governments. Supporters of greater state control argue that local leaders are better positioned to understand the needs of their schools and communities. Critics counter that federal oversight helps protect students' civil rights and promotes more consistent educational opportunities across the country. The disagreement did not end when the hearing concluded. In the months that followed, education groups, teachers' organizations, and several states continued challenging parts of the administration's restructuring efforts through the courts, arguing that major changes to the Department of Education require congressional authorization. At the same time, administration officials continued saying they wanted to shift more decision-making authority to states while preserving programs required by law. It's also important to understand one constitutional reality. The Department of Education cannot simply be abolished by executive action alone. Because Congress created the department by statute in 1979, eliminating it entirely would require new legislation passed by Congress and signed into law. That means while an administration can reorganize agencies and propose changes to funding and responsibilities, Congress ultimately determines whether the department itself continues to exist. Ultimately, this hearing wasn't just about one cabinet secretary or one exchange between lawmakers. It reflected two fundamentally different visions for American education. One side argues that federal oversight remains essential to protecting equal access and civil rights. The other believes states should have greater responsibility and flexibility in managing education. Whatever direction ultimately prevails, those decisions will affect millions of students, educators, and families across the country, making this one of the most consequential policy debates in Washington today.